Joining us on 710 KURV, we're talking about some of the stories of the people crossing into the border, part of the so-called open borders policy of one President sleeper, Joe Biden, and lots of very powerful and interesting stories. This might be one of the heavier segments, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to lie to you. Our guest is Noelle Fitchet. She's got a guest column at the Political Insider, and she has been an ambassador for Turning Point USA, PragerU, Young Women for America, and the list goes on. So your article in the Political Insider titled "The Disregarded Victims of Lax Border Policies," and this is something that this is a border market station, and we're aware of the situation, but some of the individual stories, they don't really go over the airwaves all that often. So what were some of the stories that you were able to collect? What would you like to present to us today?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. So I think something that is often overlooked when it comes to the border is the mass amount of human trafficking victims that we see that are a result of these lax border policies. There's nearly 50 million people living in modern slavery today. That's more than any other time in history. And some of the most prominent targets are Latinos, specifically coming in from the border, and that's particularly, we see that in labor trafficking as well as other forms of domestic servitude, such as domestic work, constituting 92% of the victims, and over 70% are labor trafficking victims are immigrants.
Tell us about some of the types of people that, I guess, fall through the cracks as we talk about the people coming through the border. You mentioned many different types of people that get caught up in not only trafficking, but illegal jobs and things like that. Give us a peek into this world.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of people, particularly kids, that are specifically Latino kids. They're promised from Guatemala and other countries in Latin America, they're promised a bright future, and they come to America in hopes that they can send money back to their families. And what the smugglers don't tell them is that they end up being forced into labor. Sometimes we see these in larger companies such as Skittles, McDonald's, Lucky Charms, Cheetos, a lot of these factories that are producing these very popular brand products. But we see these children being forced to work machinery, they fall off of rooftops, or they are forced into labor such as on chicken farms and other things like that. And they're working over 12 hours a day. They are forced into servitude because they have to pay back their smuggler, and as well as they have to pay for clothes, they have to pay for food and the horrible living conditions that they are forced to live in. And so they never get out of that cycle, and their families never see that money that they think that they are going to receive when they send their loved one across the border. And again, these kids are as young as 10 years old being sent and to work in these conditions, and they're being lied to by these smugglers.
Joining us on 710 KURV is Noelle Fitchet. She's got a guest column at the Political Insider titled "The Disregarded Victims of Lax Border Policies." Davey, I know you had questions about the costs it takes to get from point A to point B smuggled through the border and some of the debts. What comes to your mind right now, Davey?
What is known and provable about how people afford to pay whatever they pay? I'm not sure. I don't know if we know that. How does that work? That financing thing work?
Yeah, so a lot of the smugglers, a lot of these kids, again, from Guatemala or El Salvador, other countries in Latin America specifically, a lot of the times when we discussed in my human trafficking class at Texas A&M, we discussed some of these kids' families will give the deed to the homes that their families have. So now these smugglers, traffickers, they have the deed to their family's home, or they'll say, well, we will work for you for X amount of time in order to pay off our debt. So, for example, some kids owe upwards of $4,000 just for travel, and then you tack on their other debts of $140 roughly for paperwork, over $200 for clothes, money for dinner, which is over $50 a meal. Sometimes the traffickers will lie to the children. So then you have this exorbitant amount of debts that these children are now forced to pay, and they continue to increase every single day that they're working. And so it's a never-ending cycle of debts that they owe that they have to pay back their smuggler.
Why is it people, it's not a great question, but why is it people don't know? You don't see, I don't think you see national news stories, nothing in the New York Times, Washington Post like that. about this, like what we used to call drilling down into the story? You know anything?
The New York Times has reported on it and a few other, but I think it is largely due to, for example, our large media outlets don't always report on it. And a lot of the times people don't look into it as well. But, for example, Border Patrol said in a report that they lost over 85,000 migrant children in the last 2 years. And so this is a huge issue, and I think that a lot of people just are either missing it or not hearing enough about it.
Where do they lose them? I mean, how do you lose a child?
Exactly. That's a huge question that the U.S. State Department of Health and Human Services has not answered yet, nor has the Biden administration addressed. And so I think that more people need to put pressure to emphasize that this is extremely important, that we find out how these children were lost and where exactly they are. It's a question that, again, the current administration and the Department of Homeland Security has not answered.
Joining us on 710 KURV is Noelle Fitchet. She's got a guest column in the Political Insider titled "The Disregarded Victims of Lax Border Policies." And yeah, that's a good segue into the response from public leaders and officials who they're well aware that this stuff is happening, but I don't know about the response that they're formulating to end all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a huge concern because America is at the top destinations for child trafficking and exploitation. In America, trafficking ensnares as many as upwards of 17,000 undocumented immigrants every year, many of whom are children. And so it's a huge issue, and especially with over 40 million living in the United States. It's just a huge demographic that definitely needs to be addressed by legislators and the presidential administration.
Out of all the stories that you've collected and put into this guest column at the Political Insider, I'm perusing it, and it mentions the story shared by the New York Times of a 13-year-old that was forced into labor by a sponsor they found on Facebook. Is this, from what you have found so far, is this common practice? Just, hey, we're going on the internet, we're just looking for people that can kind of sponsor me in the meantime as I'm traveling across?
Yes, it is, and it often happens and that's what the concern is at the border when we're not properly filtering kids through the border. A lot of the adults that they're crossing with are not their parents. They're these people who either pretend to be a sponsor or they're smugglers who pretend to be their parents. So a lot of these kids are crossing with complete strangers.
That is incredible. What other revelations, as we're kind of running out of time this segment, what other revelations have you made in your research over this topic as we find out more of the stories of people falling in through the cracks as they move across the border here?
One thing that I found interesting was recently Congress proposed their so-called border security bill, and they proposed quite a lot of money. However, only 17% of that budget actually went to addressing the border. A lot of it went to other foreign countries, and I think that's something that Americans need to pay attention to especially, is that when they do propose these bills, we need to make sure and hold them accountable that all of the budget, or at least a majority of the budget, is going towards the border crisis. But again, that bill, only 17% of the funds were actually going to the border.
That is incredible. And these foreign countries that they're talking about, it has it's not like, hey, this is money to make sure that you guys can stabilize and make sure that none of your people start migrating this way. It's completely unrelated money, right?
Absolutely. A lot of these funds are going to Ukraine or going to the Middle East. They're not even in close proximity to our border crisis.
That is incredible. Noelle, thank you so much for your time here today. This was very enlightening.
Thank you.
Noelle Fitchet, a Young Voices contributor, and her guest column at the Political Insider is titled "The Disregarded Victims of Lax Border Policies." You're listening to News Talk 710 KURV, your 956 drive home.